Today I return to this channel in a new format. Once this channel was demonetized, which forced me to take a deep look at what had happened. The hardest part was having to delete every video I had poured myself into, every original script I'd built from scratch. Rather than lose everything on the channel, I chose 30 of the most viral videos and rebuilt them in this new format to post again. For those of you who've been here from the beginning, I rewrote every script from the ground up, so nothing feels repetitive. I want to share something about this particular video, the first one to ever go viral. For those who don't know me, my name is Carlos. I'm 49 years old, and since my teenage years, I've had spiritual experiences. It began with out-of-body experiences, consciousness projections, extra-physical clairvoyance, things I didn't fully understand at first. Once I started studying, everything opened up and began to make sense. During that period, I began making contact with spiritual masters who still guide me on this path of spiritual evolution and the expansion of love. I started accessing masters of the White Brotherhood and the Orishas, and was guided to practice daily bioenergetic work with kundalini activations. These were a blend of meditation and visualization, energy moving through and unblocking the chakras. Later, I began making contact with beings of light from various star systems, and eventually, I was connected to the Hermetic egregore. All of these masters still assist me to this day because beyond this channel, I carry out spiritual work for the collective well-being. When I created this channel, the first thing I wanted to talk about was kundalini because I consider myself an expert on the subject, and it was precisely the first video to go viral. As you may have noticed, my activations with kundalini didn't arise spontaneously. They came through spiritual guidance. It was the spiritual masters themselves who would activate kundalini during the practices I still perform daily. There were thousands of comments on that video, and most of them showed concern about kundalini exercises and improper activations. Over years of practice, I've come to understand that it is entirely possible to activate kundalini safely. Many people think it's forbidden or extremely dangerous, but I want to be clear, it can be done safely. I'm not talking about full kundalini awakening. I'm talking about something I've nicknamed brief kundalini activations, small, targeted activations designed to unblock and align the chakras, opening a connection to life energy, well-being, and spiritual awakening. I practice both the simpler forms and the more advanced ones. At the beginning, guidance from the masters didn't come all at once. I had to study intensely to understand what was happening to me. 40 minutes of meditation, a stable posture, calibrated breathing, no particular expectation. And then, without warning, without any buildup, something lit at the base of my spine. It wasn't a thought, it wasn't an image, it was pressure, heat, a localized activation that asked no permission and waited for no interpretation. I sat completely still, not from discipline, because any movement seemed wrong in the face of what was happening. That moment divided everything that came before from everything that came after. I spent the months that followed trying to understand what had happened, not in a broadly spiritual sense, in a mechanical sense. What exactly had been activated? Where? How? And why at that moment, after years of practice with no such effect? While the answers I found in Western yoga didn't satisfy the question, the language of energy awakening and kundalini ascension described the phenomenon without explaining the mechanism. It was like receiving a diagnosis that names the symptom without touching the cause. That's when the Egyptian Hermetic texts shifted the frame. You may have felt something similar, perhaps in a meditation, perhaps in a moment of unexpected silence, a warmth at the base of the spine, a pressure that rises, a sensation that seems to come from inside the body, but from a place you didn't know was there. That is not metaphor. What you felt has a precise anatomical location, a specific Hermetic name, and a measurable consequence in the nervous system. It's not suggestion, it's not placebo. It's the signal of a system that was already operating before you had words to describe it. After years of tracking the patterns of who accesses this knowledge and who doesn't, what I've learned to recognize is that arriving here is not random, and it's not the algorithm, it's something that precedes the algorithm. Thoth in the Hermetic tradition calls this a choice. I'll translate what that concept means mechanically throughout this video. For now, what matters is this. This video begins at that switch that turned on. In 391 AD, Emperor Theodosius I issued the decree that closed the last pagan temples of the Roman Empire. He didn't merely close them, he ordered their destruction. The Library of Alexandria was not the only archive to disappear during that period. The Serapeum of Alexandria was destroyed. The great Egyptian initiation centers, Hermopolis, Karnak, had already ceased their ritual functions centuries earlier, and their archives were never recovered. The papyri that were never copied because the speed of the destruction allowed no time. What was burned were not merely texts, they were protocols. Protocols for the transmission of knowledge, knowledge that depended on sequence, on preparation, on specific conditions of reception, knowledge that cannot simply be written down and preserved. It must be delivered within a context that makes the delivery possible. Rome destroyed the context. What remained were fragments with no instructions for use. The Inquisition completed the work. Between the 13th and 18th centuries, any transmission that touched what original Hermeticism had taught, the nature of consciousness, the mechanisms of transformation, the relationship between body and cosmos, was suppressed, not as abstract heresy, as a concrete threat to a structure of religious mediation that depended on human beings having no direct access to their own mechanism of transmutation. What arrived in the modern West under the name of yoga and kundalini passed through that double filter. What wasn't destroyed was sanitized, translated into wellness language, inserted into manageable practice structures, stripped of the architecture of preparation that made activation sustainable. The most honest reading of this pattern is not historical vandalism, it's dependency engineering. What was removed was not harmless mysticism. It was the instruction that made human beings self-sufficient in their own transmutation. And systems of control don't destroy what is harmless. What I cannot trace with precision is whether the sanitization of modern yoga was deliberate or simply the result of 2,000 years of incomplete transmission. For this argument, the outcome is the same. The original protocol never arrived. What reached us is the shadow of what existed, and there is a name for what that shadow points to. The name Egyptian Hermeticism used for what the East and West translated as kundalini energy was something else entirely, and the difference is not one of vocabulary. The entire Western framework of kundalini operates within an energy model. There is a dormant energy at the base of the spine that can be awakened, that rises through the chakras, that produces elevated states of consciousness. The practice is activation. The goal is ascension. The practitioner is the agent. The Hermetic texts, especially the fragments of the Corpus Hermeticum preserved at Nag Hammadi, only partially translated in the 20th century, use a radically different model. They don't speak of energy, they speak of intelligence. That sounds like a vocabulary distinction until you see what it implies in practice. Energy is moved, intelligence operates. When you work within an energy model, you are trying to move something with technique, with breath work, with directed intention. The practitioner controls the process, or at least believes they do. There is a sequence, a goal, a sense of measurable progression. Intelligence doesn't work that way. Intelligence responds to coherence, not to effort. It does not obey the practitioner's intention. It operates according to its own logic, which can be summoned when the conditions are present, but cannot be forced when they are not. No technique compensates for the absence of a precondition. The analogy I use is musical. The difference between energy and intelligence is the difference between practicing an instrument and recognizing the score that the instrument is reading. You can master the instrument, technique, posture, breathing, all the controllable variables, and still be reading the wrong score, or reading without understanding what is written. The execution can be flawless. The result will still feel off in some way you can't name. There is a third level to this analogy that is rarely mentioned. The score may be reading you. That is what the Hermetic model proposes, that the intelligence embedded in the human body is not waiting to be activated by the practitioner. It is already running. What changes with correct practice is not turning the system on, but creating the conditions for the system to recognize that it has enough ground to operate at greater scale. When Egyptian Hermeticism describes what Western yoga calls kundalini, it is describing a living intelligence embedded in the human body as a mechanism of dimensional transmutation, not as latent potential waiting to be activated by a sufficiently advanced practitioner, as an operating system already running, one that responds when the access conditions are met and remains in standby when they are not. When they are not, what I didn't expect to find when studying the Hermetic texts was the precision of the vocabulary. They had specific terms for states that modern neuroscience only named in the last 30 years, not poetic approximations. Descriptions that correspond to clinical data with a specificity I still have no satisfying explanation to dismiss. Intelligence, not energy. That distinction repositions everything that follows. And there is a documented case that demonstrates with involuntary clarity what happens when it is ignored. Pandit Gopi Krishna was a civil servant under the British government in Kashmir, married, a family man, a meditation practitioner for 17 years, disciplined, without excess, without any seeking of altered states. In December of 1937, during a routine meditation session, something happened that would shape the next 45 years of his life. A current of white light rose through his spine. It was visible to him, luminous, electric, and at a speed that had no parallel in any previous experience. It reached his skull, and it didn't stop. What followed was not enlightenment. It was crisis. Bullfight of Gopi Krishna could not function. Hallucinations, physical sensations with no name in any medical system available to him. Intense heat that responded to no intervention. Disruption of sleep, of eating, of cognition. His wife believed he was dying. He himself wasn't certain he wasn't. It took 3 years to stabilize, and more than a decade to understand what had happened. Gopi Krishna was not alone in what he described. Researching the available literature in Sanskrit, in Arabic, in late Greek, he found dozens of historical cases with the same signature: sudden activation, prolonged crisis, gradual stabilization, followed by enhanced capacities. The pattern was consistent enough to be documented as a phenomenon, not as an individual anomaly. He wrote several books about the process, including Kundalini, the evolutionary energy in man, which became a key reference on the subject. He corresponded with neuroscientists and psychiatrists. He proposed that what he had experienced was the activation of a real biological system, which he called the Kundalini system, with measurable physiological consequences in the central nervous system. The scientific community did not receive him. The spiritual community reduced him to an extreme case, an unrepresentative exception. What the case of Gopi Krishna demonstrates in my reading is not horror. It's a negative map. It's the precise documentation of what happens when an intelligence of planetary scale meets a nervous system with no preparation. Not tragedy, evidence. And evidence has a different function than warning. He had no map. There is a belief widely distributed across the Western yoga universe. Kundalini is an advanced spiritual practice that, when practiced correctly, produces gradual and safe awakening. There are certified teachers, standardized sequences, training curricula with minimum hours, assessments, and certificates of completion. The implicit and often explicit message is that the process is manageable, that with proper guidance, the practitioner progresses in a controlled way through predictable stages. And then there is the case of Gopi Krishna. Not as an exception that confirms the rule, as data that collides head-on with it. Gopi Krishna did not practice incorrectly. He practiced with exemplary discipline for 17 years. He was not seeking activation. He did not force any process. What happened to him happened through the most orthodox path possible and produced a crisis that lasted years. The two things cannot coexist. Either the process is fundamentally manageable, and then the case of Gopi Krishna requires explanation within the very system that claims this, or the process has a nature that the notion of safe practice does not capture. And the case of Gopi Krishna is the data point that indicates the second reading. The question this raises is not about Gopi Krishna, it's about what Western yoga is selling when it sells manageable safety. It's worth noting what happened historically. Yoga arrived in the West in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, filtered through figures who needed to make it palatable for Victorian and then American audiences. What had been a system of rigorous preparation, one that included years of preliminary work before any approach to the more intense practices, was reformatted as wellness technology. The physical practices were separated from the architecture of preparation that gave them context and safety. What remained was a collection of techniques without the system that made them sustainable. The result is that the typical Western practitioner learns to activate without learning to sustain, learns to move without learning what is being moved, and learns to call this spiritual progress because they have no vocabulary to compare it to what the original system described. What the Hermetic texts offer is not a more powerful version of the same practices. It's a different architecture of relationship with the process, one that starts from the recognition that an autonomous intelligence is involved, and that this intelligence does not respond to technique. It responds to the coherence of the terrain. This architecture has a name. It has a sequence, and it has a central distinction that Gopi Krishna discovered the hard way, one that the Hermetic texts document as a precondition, not a consequence. The distinction that Hermetic protocols make and that Western yoga lost in translation is not one of technique, it's one of precondition. What determines whether a kundalini activation is sustainable or chaotic is not the intensity of the practice, nor the depth of spiritual intention. It is the coherence of the terrain. Coherence of terrain is what the Hermetic texts call the preparation of the 7-dimensional portals. What the Hindu system maps as chakras, the Egyptian Hermetic system maps as portals, and the difference is not merely terminological. In the Tantric system, chakras are energy centers to be activated. In the Hermetic system, portals are functional addresses of a system that is already operating, one that requires a minimum level of openness at each address for the ascending transmission to be sustainable. The closest analogy is electrical. You don't connect a high voltage system to wiring that wasn't dimensioned for it. The wiring may conduct, but the current will destroy whatever was not prepared to receive it. What I cannot verify with full rigor is whether the Hermetic mapping of the 7 portals corresponds exactly to the Tantric anatomy of the 7 chakras. The systems use distinct terminologies and don't cite each other. What I can confirm is that the function described at each stage is the same. What the Egyptian Hermetic tradition calls the Djed, frequently translated as stable column or pillar of Osiris, is the technical name for the transmission channel when the 7 portals are at minimum coherence. It is the address of the state in which the fire serpent can ascend without collapsing the system. Beyond its symbolic layer, a description of a specific functional configuration that either is present or is not. What this map is trying to do is what any genuine technology of consciousness attempts: to replace metaphor with operational instruction. Gopi Krishna didn't have that address, he had the activation, and discovered through the impact where the terrain was not prepared. Stop for a moment. You were not studying kundalini from the outside. You were sitting on the threshold. What I described in the last few sections, the architecture of the 7 portals, the Djed as a functional address, the distinction between energy and intelligence, is not an external system you are learning about. It is the description of what your nervous system already carries. What I share now is no longer argument. I have no interest in convincing whoever has come this far was convinced by the journey. What remains is to receive, and what is received is not information. Stay where you are. Feel the contact of your feet with the floor, the weight of your body on the surface supporting it. This is not a visualization instruction. It's a request to pay attention to what is already happening in your body as you read or hear this. Now, the base of your spine. That exact region where this conversation began, where that warmth was described in the first minute of this video. Don't force anything. Don't construct elaborate visualizations. Simply direct your attention there as if you were listening for a very faint sound in a noisy environment and needed inner silence to identify it precisely. What you perceive in that region may be heat. It may be pressure. It may simply be a quality of attention settling in, a kind of weight of awareness that has landed there. There is no wrong answer. What there is attention. And attention in this system is already a form of summoning. Breathe once, completely. The sensation you recognize in that place, whatever form it takes, does not need to be interpreted right now. It doesn't need to be classified, ranked, or compared to descriptions you've already read. It needs to be recognized. There is a difference between identifying and recognizing. Identifying is naming something external. Recognizing is finding something that was already familiar before you knew it was. You have what is needed. The terrain was prepared by what you moved through in this video. The portals open not through forced intention, not through willpower or maximum concentration, but through recognition, through you simply perceiving what was already there. Stay here for a moment. no rush to move on. What tends to happen at this point is that the viewer tries to classify what they felt. Meditation, directed breathing, auto-suggestion. The most honest reading I have is that none of those categories were built for what just happened. They are approximations of lesser phenomena. What we moved through together here has a name in the Hermetic system. It has a specific function in the sequence of preparation, and what was activated now does not disappear when the video ends. From here, what I present is no longer information, it is confirmation. The Egyptian Hermetic system did not only describe the mechanism of individual activation, it described collective timing, the periods of the cosmic cycle in which mass activation was possible, expected, and necessary. The central cycle is the Great Year, 25,920 years, the time the Earth takes to complete a full precession of its axis. The Hermetists divided this cycle into phases, periods of greater and lesser permeability of collective consciousness to what they called ascending influence. They were not alone in this. What caught my attention was identifying a pattern of convergence across multiple spiritual traditions. The Maya calendar pointing to 2012 as the end of a cycle, contemporary interpretations of the transition between ages in Hinduism, and the rediscovery of the texts of Nag Hammadi in the 20th century as signs of a moment of collective revelation. I didn't expect that convergence. I didn't expect the pattern to be so consistent. The Maya calendar places the end of the 13th Baktun, a cycle of 5,125 years, on December 21st, 2012. The Hindu tradition describes cycles of cosmic transformation, including the transition between ages in terms of astronomical markers, which some contemporary interpreters associate with this same period. The texts of Nag Hammadi, rediscovered in the 20th century, describe the transformation of consciousness as a collective event, which interpreters in the Hermetic lineage read as relevant to this period of precession alignment. And the data from Earth's geomagnetic field documents an acceleration in the weakening of the planetary magnetic field precisely during this period, which is not esoteric. It is data published by NOAA and geophysical institutes in conventional scientific journals. Multiple converging observations, each from independent sources, pointing to the same window. I may be reading convergence where there is only coincidence. That is the honest risk of any synthesis of this kind. But the density of the pattern makes dismissal difficult. When you place the Hermetic calendar over the documented geomagnetic field data from the last 3 decades, the convergence is too dense to dismiss as a coincidence of interpretation. What this timing means for those who are activating now is not a secondary detail in this argument. It is the context that gives the individual mission its true scale. And you are here, exactly at this point in the cycle. You are at this point in the cycle, not as an accidental spectator, as an anchor. That distinction changes what is about to happen between us. What the Hermetic Thoth called choice, and what this video's title carried from the very first second as a promise not yet translated. I must now deliver in the language of mechanism, because choice in the Hermetic system is not mystical selection, it is recognition of configuration. When the Hermetic texts describe that Thoth chooses those who will awaken, what is being documented is this: the nervous system of those who can sustain full activation carries a specific signature, not of spiritual merits accumulated across incarnations, not of purity of intention or declared level of consciousness, of functional coherence, the 7-dimensional portals at a minimum degree of openness so that the fire serpent can ascend without the system collapsing. You made it here. That data is not small. Before delivering what comes next, there is a position I need to name clearly, because the alternative would be dishonesty. Private awakening is not activation, not in the Hermetic tradition, not in what Gopi Krishna documented over 13 years of integration. He did not spend that time in that state because the process was dangerous. He spent it because it took that long to understand that the activated energy alone was not the point. Collective anchoring was. Kundalini that awakens only in you without connecting to the frequency network this argument has mapped, without functioning as an anchor for the morphogenetic field, is just movement. The process includes mission, and mission is collective by structure, not by choice. That is what I believe. The Hermetic tradition points in the same direction. I don't know how many anchors are needed for the planetary field to cross the threshold of reorganization. No tradition specifies that number with precision, and this is the last limitation I name here because what comes next doesn't depend on it. You don't need to know the size of the network, you need to know your place in it. Now we are at the threshold. What we built together arrives at the only point that matters. The protocol, not as a map, as a crossing. Place your hands on your knees, palms facing up. Phase 1, the terrain. Feel the base of your spine, not as a visualization exercise, as real contact with the surface where you are sitting, the concrete weight of the body in this moment, in this place. That sensation I named at the start of this video, that subtle warmth, that quiet pressure at the base of the spine, you recognize it now from a different place, not as a random effect that happened once and may or may not return, as the signal of a system that was already active before you had the map to read it. What you activate now, with this attention, with this recognition, is intelligence, not energy. Intelligence, not energy. Let that settle for a moment before moving on. Phase 2, the address. The 7-dimensional portals are mapped in the body you inhabit. The Djed is not a symbol, it is the address, and you have that address now, not as a learned concept, but as a recognized location. From base to crown, each portal, in sequence, recognizes the intention of passage. This is not force. It's not visualization built through effort. It is coherence of terrain. The portals respond in proportion to how much they have been prepared, and they were prepared by what you moved through in this video. The fire serpent was not waiting for permission. It was waiting for the map. Phase 3, the anchor. You are not doing this only for yourself. The activation happening now enters a field. The morphogenetic field this argument mapped is not metaphor. It is the mechanism by which awakened consciousness reorganizes the collective substrate from which we all emerge. We don't know the exact number. We know the network exists, and that every anchor shifts the field, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a functional contribution to a process that is happening with or without the participation of any specific individual. The question that remains is what you do with the position you have recognized. What happened in this argument and what happened just now in this silence, I can name with the precision this journey sustains. You entered here as someone who had already heard of Kundalini. You can no longer be in that position, not because you now believe something different. Beliefs can be abandoned. Because you now know the real mechanism, the operational distinction between authentic and forced activation, the Hermetic architecture of the 7 portals as functional addresses, and your structural place in the anchoring network of this cycle. That position cannot be undone. The Kundalini you carry from here is not the same one that reached you before this video. Your relationship to this territory has been shifted, and that shift is the delivery this argument promised from the very first second. Thoth chose you. What that statement meant in the title was an invitation. What it means now is confirmation. What you received here is still integrating data the body already knew and the mind has just mapped. Takes time to settle. That is the process, not a side effect. This channel continues investigating in this direction, the protocols that never reached the West, the lineages that survived the sanitization, and what this cosmic cycle means for those who are activating now. If you want to continue with more context, the channel is here.